You raised the question about the competition. I think composition competition relates to that because he felt that the musical marketplace, as it existed at the time, was not adequate to encouraging serious composition. Berlioz felt that too. Berlioz actually has a very touching passage in the memoirs in which he recalls a time when he dreamed a symphony. And he woke up and realized, while it was still fresh in his mind, that if he made the mistake of copying it down, he would then have to, and he calculated how much money it would cost him to hire the musicians and hire the copyists for the parts and so on, and he would have to actually go into debt. He would become bankrupt because of this latest symphony, and he decided to let it vanish.
So this is new to me. Berlioz suppressed not the works themselves, but even the desire to write some works, in spite of everything he did write, that required extensive copying, all his orchestral music. Romeo and Juliet, the Symphonie Fantastique, Harold in Italy, he wrote them, but he might have written more, but he didn't want to. Now, I think this needs some explanation because I might have been under the impression that this was a great period for serious musical composition because of all the serious great composers who were active, but apparently not so much.
It was a struggle. It was absolutely a struggle. Every one of the great composers that we can think of had some other way of making a living. And it's important to remember that the situation now is maybe not so different from the situation then. Chopin taught the daughters of the aristocracy how to play piano. A number of them were very good too, but they were aristocrats, and aristocratic ladies were not permitted to hold jobs and therefore play music publicly. So they didn't. So we don't hear about Chopin's students, but he had students. And a number of the composers were writers and were music critics. So Schumann and Berlioz and Weber and Wagner, a number of them made a lot of their money by writing, especially early in their career. Some of them were conductors, of course, as well. Wagner and Mendelssohn and Berlioz with his own works.
So one conclusion we can draw, not just from this point, but from some of the others, is that the highest, greatest levels of taste are never going to be a given. Not then, not now. Yeah. How does that play into some of the other points? I would need even to remind myself what they are. Okay, music education in the schools. Somebody now might say, well, I don't know if they learned it in the schools, but surely almost everybody played the piano. Many people played stringed instruments. People walked about the streets of Vienna, or so I've read, looking for string quartet partners. So why would he be insisting on music education if there was a general level of music literacy?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much Liszt had thought through that point, but he did have a point in mentioning it, which is that music in the schools could encourage group singing. And group singing is a kind of civic activity. So he was thinking of music in a very particular way. This is a way of inculcating certain kinds of group values. It encourages people. If you make music together, you're respecting each other, you're learning how to work together. And he understood some things that people in the music education business now talk about also, that a student who's in a band, or middle school band or high school chorus, learns a certain kind of teamwork and how to excel and show discipline to a task, and at the same time how to hold back on the ego enough to blend with others, and when to stand out, when to back off, all of those skills.
And you even have some people taking this into the corporate world and using orchestral life as a demonstration of how people can work together. So this point about music education, it's good you explained it. It doesn't mean what we might think it means.
It had a larger significance for Liszt, and that's why he's also concerned with religious music also. He's very concerned with what are the ways in which music can help people build a sense of community.
And probably the best music. He wants them singing and playing music that fits his concept, which is probably not too different from our own, about what the proper aesthetic level of music is. But then when he talks about state-sponsored festivals of symphonic music, why would those have been necessary? Again, it would seem perhaps that with so many composers who we now revere writing symphonic works, that there must have been performances of them.
A lot of pieces that we know very well were actually not performed that much at the time. People might have encountered them through piano four-hand arrangements, for example,
right.
But adequate symphonic realization and adequate performance of choral and orchestral works was relatively rare. The chance to hear the Beethoven Ninth,
right.
for example. Habeneck, the great Beethoven conductor in France in the 1820s and 30s, rehearsed the Ninth Symphony for several years, performing one movement at a time each year and then finally putting it all together. A little bit the way we do the ring cycle
right.
of Wagner.
And this was after Liszt wrote this, a few years after, or about the same
around the same time, yeah.
Because at that time, it seems maybe strange to us because Beethoven was already dead and quite revered, but yet his symphonies were not everyday concert staples at all. And when Habeneck started those concerts in Paris, where the symphonies were done regularly, it was a revelation to people.
Yeah, it was also a revelation to Wagner when he came to Paris, because he said those performances were actually better than the Beethoven performances that he could hear back in Germany. And that's a nice reminder to us that the level of orchestral performance that we have come to expect. We live in an age now of remarkably high standards of orchestral performance. There was nothing like that in the 19th century.
No, and I know from some of the reading I've done, particularly from William Weber, who has studied the history and, in a sense, the sociology of performance then, that a lot of the players playing serious symphonic repertoire were amateurs, as compared to the professionals who would be playing in the opera pits, or maybe playing for Johann Strauss Sr. in Vienna, playing commercial waltzes.
Right. They also had very few rehearsals for these works, and often they were permitted to send someone in their place to the rehearsal, so that the orchestra member who actually played the performance had not been at the rehearsals. He had sent his student or something, and because he got a better paying job playing dance music at some wealthy home.
Which he actually had to take in order to make a living.
Right.
So it's not completely irresponsible.
No.
So then given that, now what you have is a scene here where opera was maybe the most popular art form, and Rossini, the most popular composer in Europe. I mean, the most popular musical art form, opera. And people playing opera excerpts on the piano at home and singing opera arias. Why then, if Liszt wants symphonic music encouraged, does he also want opera encouraged? One would have thought that opera was a smash commercial success then.
Yeah, that's interesting. It may be that he put opera in there just to make his plan complete. He doesn't talk much about the problems of opera elsewhere, except it's clear that there were also important operas that he thought weren't performed as often and at the level that they should be. And we have to remember that the great works of Mozart, for example, were often carved up, and the musical numbers were put to totally different librettos and with different words. This happened with Weber's Der Freischütz also, where Castile Blas, the Paris music critic, wrote a whole new libretto for it about Robin Hood. And Berlioz was furious about it and complained.
And then we can remember Berlioz's book, Evenings with the Orchestra, which is cast in the form of imaginary conversations between orchestra musicians while they play crap in the opera house.
That's right.
But then he'll have a chapter where it simply says, Mozart's Don Giovanni is played, no one says a word.
Right. They're too busy making music and paying attention.
So maybe Liszt wanted encouragement of the best
I think
operas.
so. That's definitely